Hey guys, welcome back. We are now starting module 2, dose of our online learning in Hebrew world and culture. So just to give you a heads up, there's going to be 3 of these videos for the lectures because we usually break all this stuff down. So hang with me, but I do want to give you the advice to pace yourself. This one's probably the heaviest in workload of all the modules that we have coming up. And I also need to preemptively apologize that I've got some kind of allergy. So if I sneeze or cough, please don't get too worried or concerned. I'm just suffering a little bit of allergies right now. Any case, let's jump right on in. So we're going to start. This is the first lecture, the prophetic response. Now we've already talked about some prophetic material way back in Exodus, and I've tried to point some of that out as we kind of moved forward. And what we did last week in module 1 is kind of setting us up because with the decline of the kings, we see the centering of the prophets in their role here in Israel. So what we're going to do today is we're going to look at the prophetic response in terms of the literary devices and some of the techniques that are used that help us kind of understand the function of the prophet. But this is also going to be a set of tools that you can use to do your analysis as you work through all the prophetic material. So this week we're going to start with 2 of my absolute favorites, Amos and Hosea. I am so devastated that I cannot be in class with you for these materials. They are so amazing. And I just miss you guys. So, but we're going to make the best of it. But this lecture is about sort of those, like I said, those functions and those pieces. Then we'll do a little more of a deep dive into Amos and then a pretty deep dive into Hosea. So here we go. Jumping right along. Okay. So when you read the prophets, it's just general overview. They're typically arranged by 2 principles. The size of the prophets, so you have the major prophets and the minor prophets. You often hear them addressed that way. In fact, I think in your textbook, Dr. Collins will use minor prophet and major prophet as a way of distinguishing the various groups. And chronology, so that's the order in which they are, either the subject material that they address or the order in which they were believed to be composed. So the other thing that to note for is that when we do the work in these is that we're probably going to focus definitely on these books in chronological order. I'm not so much interested in organization by size. That's why we're starting with 2 of the minor prophets, Amos and Hosea, rather than the canonical order. This is not how they would appear in your biblical text that you have. So you're kind of wondering where things are, why we're kind of jumping all around like a frog in a hot skillet, then that's kind of what's going on there. So let's get started. All right, we're back with an old friend of ours, the Deuteronomistic historian, who will now be designated as DH, just for my sanity. This is kind of important because the DH really is important in terms of how you kind of make sense, especially as a Hebrew, of the things going down between 722 and 586 BCE. The reality is that Israel is being conquered, and even though Northern Kingdom is defeated by the Assyrians, the Southern Kingdom of Judea is able to hang on for another 200 years or so. Then they're defeated by the Babylonians. The reality is that, all the destruction, the exile, and really, the devastation, right? You got to remember, like, when the Babylonians conquered the Southern Kingdom, I mean, they level the temple. And so right there, you have 2 big external signs that are so important to Hebrew identity completely removed, right? And what does that mean then as a Hebrew? What does that mean? Does this mean that my entire faith system that I've had, and everything that I've ever believed in, my understanding of Yahweh as all powerful and supreme authority in the universe, is what's going on there? And you can imagine, right? If there are probably persons definitely of the Abrahamic faith traditions who are having similar questions right now, given our current global health crisis, right? where it just, this invisible enemy. And what does that mean? And does this mean that everything that I thought was true isn't true anymore? And so that's certainly a question going around. And again, let me emphasize, you have two big external signs: the temple, and then of course the kingdom and land piece that have been removed. So that's a really big deal. And so what do we do with that? Does this just mean that, again, it's all over and Yahweh is not who we thought Yahweh was? It's interesting because what the DH does is really invert that and flip it around and say, you know what? That's not what this is. You're reading this whole situation wrong. We've told you for a minute that this was potentially coming down the line, and here's why it's coming down the line. We've got some problems, and we haven't worked on those problems or changed our ways. And we knew if we continued down that path, this was what was in store. And this is, rather than God abandoning the world or not being who he says he is, this is rather God executing his judgment. And this is an absolute demonstration of his power. So powerful is the Hebrew God that he can use other nations, other communities, other groups to execute that judgment against the Hebrews. So this is the fulfillment of all those things that were foretold and warned against as it's coming down the line. So, for example, you will even see the invocation of Moses' name about the consequences of idolatry that we spent a little time with in working through the Exodus material. So, but there are some differences how the prophets handle it. So if they're in line with the DH about this whole inverted idea that rather than this is a sign of God's abandonment or lack of power, but rather an absolute demonstration of power, this is where they differ too. If they're in line in that, this is where they separate. The first thing is what the problem was. Idolatry is going to come up. We've talked about this, and if you've been writing in your notebooks the little idolatry lines, add this one in there because you definitely are going to see idolatry. It's evolved a little more than what we first saw with the Mosaic material and even what we potentially saw in some of the monarchical material, but it's still there. The other one that's really interesting is the social justice material. So for those of you that are looking through that material, especially in Amos, you're going to notice the social justice bend on it. The other piece of this is that there is, despite all the devastation, all the darkness, right? Every one of these prophetic texts are going to end with hope, right? There's a definite emphasis on the future restoration and glory of Israel. There is something down the line, and that is pretty consistent, right? That there's always a way in which the relationship is potentially can be repaired, that there's always just that line that holds Yahweh and Israel together. So thinking about Amos, so let's, as part of our case study, just a little background on Amos. One, he's the first of those literary prophets. He's located in the northern kingdom. He's moving around a little before the Assyrian threat and potentially right during that time. As you notice in the first couple of lines, he's identified as a sheep breeder. He tends fig trees, and he signifies his prophetic authority when Yahweh is sent to deliver his prophecy. He's sent by Yahweh to deliver these prophecies. There is speculation, I think Collins talks about this in his textbook, that he is wealthy and educated, and he's sent by the priest at Bethel to the southern kingdom in Judea to hear the message. So there are four main sections in Amos, and this is pretty standard rubric, though, some exceptions, that how the prophetic materials break down. The first being, you get these oracles of doom, right? Which, little side note, if I ever start a college, I think this is going to be my mascot, the oracles of doom. I just think about how cool that would be to roll out on a football field or a basketball court or a soccer pitch with that, like, right? And think about the uniforms, how great this would be. All right, okay, back on track here. All right, then there's the three short oracles to the women of Samaria, the wealthy of Samaria and Jerusalem, and then Israel as a whole, right? So there's some particular prophecies aimed at some particular groups. And then we get the symbolism or symbolic vision of judgment. Remember, Collins is big on the symbolic language piece, which is one of the reasons we use this. And of course, then there's the epilogue, which is going to have the restoration piece or the hope piece. Okay, so when you go through this material, there are going to be some literary themes that are used quite a bit. So I want to go through those with you individually, and then we're going to go back to Amos in the second lecture. But here's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about editorial notes. We're going to talk about something called diverse materials. We're going to talk about the call, which is really important, metaphors, and the varied literary forms, okay? All right, so editorial notes. Editorial notes tend to be written in the third person, and they often are located at the opening of the book. So take a moment, hit pause on this, and take a look at that chapter 1, verse 1 in Amos, right? That's where we get like who he is. It's kind of weird because we're thinking it should be in the first person, him introducing himself, but it's in the third person. And almost every one of the prophetic books that we're going to study contain that kind of introduction, right? And they usually have these elements in them. The idea of the prophet, the place that he's from, and something that indicates the time and the setting. And again, it's always written in the third person. In fact, that's usually the giveaway that you're working with the editorial notes. And then you see two main kinds of writing that show up in the prophets. And this is where I think sometimes it gets confusing unless you've worked with these materials before. One is the first person passages in which the prophet speaks directly. And then the second is the third person passages where the prophet, it seems that it's written by disciples or other authors after the prophet's oracles are collected. Okay, so a really great example of that is in Amos 7. The diverse materials, excuse me, are usually materials that have been collected, revised, or supplemented. The prophet's oracles are delivered over a lot of different movements in time. So it's not like you get like this one delivery and chunk of a prophecy. There are several prophecies often, and they are all collected and redacted and put together over a period of time, either by the prophet himself or his disciples. So prophet oracles were, commonly written down and transmitted in Near Eastern societies. I think Dr. Collins does a really great job of explaining that. But one of the important features I want you to note is that these accounts don't really follow chronological order, because we've talked about this. The function of this literature is not to give you a historical or journalistic accounting of something. They're really concerned with other principles, and they're going to move those materials around and put them in the order that allows those principles or those points to be made. So for example, in Amos 3:2, you get the catchword that's deployed to connect it with another oracle. So that's kind of one of those things. And so one of the things I say to students, I don't know if Collins says this or not, but this is one of the things I definitely would say is that these books are best viewed as anthologies, meaning that they are collections that are pulled all together for literary reasons or theological reasons rather than chronological ones. So that's a really important thing to keep in mind. The call, it's kind of self-explanatory, but it's in every single prophetic material. This is where the claim to authority is going to happen. How can this person speak on behalf of Yahweh? So, and another quality that the call has, it's often included in these descriptions, is that it's irresistible. You can't say no. So think about our Mosaic moment in the burning bush, right? Moses is hesitant, but eventually gives in. We've seen that over and over again, that, you can try to arm wrestle God, but this is just not going to work. So this underscores that the call to the prophetic work is irresistible, and it also comes with a particular authority. And I really do encourage you to think about all the work that you've done already up to this point on prophetic authority, because the seeds for those lines have been planted for quite a while. Okay, the metaphors. Amos, Hosea, we're going to talk about a big metaphor in Hosea in a minute, but Amos uses two primary metaphors in his prophecy. As you were reading through that text, one of the things you may have seen is the phrase, the word of Yahweh came up to prophet X, right? And that's a way to show that Yahweh speaks to the prophets in the language that is repeated by the prophet. Amos, like many prophets, is said to see visions. And in fact, we talked about those 5 symbolic visions that he has. And these visions may be of Yahweh speaking or performing some action. They can sometimes be about a big, extraordinary, fantastic event. Or sometimes, as we saw in Amos, they're just ordinary objects that carry incredibly significant symbolic significance. So, one that you may be noting in secular life is, with the upcoming of Easter, right? All the traditions that surround that. You take an egg, and now an egg means new birth and spring and renewal, right? So an ordinary thing like that, an ordinary object, takes on that kind of symbolic significance. So that's the kind of thing. You saw that with the basket or the plumber's line, right? So the 2 visions are pretty extraordinary, like the locust plague and the supernatural fire are right up against the plumb line. And do you know what a plumb line is? The chalk line, you roll it out. Like if any of you have ever lined a baseball field or a softball field, you use a plumb line to line the fields, right? And they do the same thing when they do it in construction or when you're digging to where you're going to put your plumbing lines in the earth. So you pop the string and the chalk line comes after you measure it out. Or a fruit basket, right? So it's really interesting because you can see a lot of that diversity in the metaphoric language. And finally, there are a lot of different literary forms. This is one of the reasons I say to students, when you're working with prophetic materials, think of these as anthologies, both within the actual individual text, but also within the corpus of the prophetic literature. And you're going to see all kinds of writing, all types of writing. So for some of the examples that you're going to get just right off from Amos, the oracle against the nation, hymns, you're going to get songs or laments, proverbs, and then we even in Hosea, we're going to see an example of a riv, or what we call a covenant lawsuit. So all of those things are part of that. All right, that's how we're going to end with this particular lecture. I really encourage you there, as at the beginning of your the section here on prophetic literature, a really nifty like 4-page bit that Collins gives you that will kind of clarify some of these things, but I do think will help you with this. So we're going to move on to Amos in the next set. So take a breather, get a snack, and I'll see you in a moment.